Okay, it's wonderful to meet you all. I'm sure the feelings are entirely mutual.
Yes.
Can you hear me? Can you hear me?
No, a little louder. What? A little louder.
Yes, we can.
I couldn't work it out because it's like a complete disinterest. So I couldn't work out whether you could hear me or you couldn't hear me. It's like the fellow comes into the auditorium to speak, and he asks, "Can everybody hear me at the back?" So someone at the back shouts out, he says, "I can hear you, maybe I can move to somewhere else where I can't hear you." So if you can hear me, that's great. If you can't, that's probably even better. There's an ancient joke they tell about a very large lady, very calorifically challenged, who's walking down the road, and there's a beggar sitting on the side, and he says to her, "Lady, spare a dime. I haven't eaten for 3 days." And the lady looks at him and he says, "Wow," she says, "I admire your fortitude." The concept in Judaism, there's a concept of giving. Whether it's tzedakah or whether it's chesed, we'll have a look and see what the difference is between the two, whether it's charity or whether it's good deeds. But we need to try to understand what's the function, what's the point of giving. So the truth is, we could probably end right now by understanding that the reason that we have to give is because God wants us to give. Once we understand that, we don't really need to know anything else. If God wants us to do it, then that should be enough. But of course, we need to understand it better. We need to be able to reach the point where not only are we able to give, but we want to give. And maybe to reach the point of understanding that we're all able to give, even if we don't have the physical wherewithal to be able to give, but that we've got something to give, maybe not money, but other things as well. It's a very beautiful idea. They tell over a story about a person who was approached to donate to a worthy cause, and he gave twice. He gave a nice sum of money the first time, and then he waited a few minutes, and then he gave a nice sum of money again. So when they asked him, why did he give twice? So he said the first time was because when he heard the story, it was such a painful story, he was moved and he wanted to give. But the second time was to fulfill the mitzvah, to fulfill the commandment of giving. The depth of the story is that giving, if we want to do this properly, so we have to have some kind of what's called kavanah, some kind of intent when we give. Shouldn't just give, but behind the giving there should be the correct intentions as well. The Gemara, the Talmud in Sota, teaches us that the Torah begins with chesed, with kindness, and the Torah ends with chesed. The Torah begins with chesed, that it says that HaKadosh Baruch Hu, that God gave clothing to Adam and to Chava in the Garden of Eden after they sinned. And the Torah ends with chesed, because the Torah says that HaKadosh Baruch Hu, God, buried Moshe at the end of his life. And the rabbis learn, the sages learn from that if the Torah begins with chesed and ends with chesed, then the whole of the Torah is chesed. And the sages teach us that we have to emulate God. So how are we supposed to emulate God? Our emulation of God is going to be done through chesed, through kindness. We're going to try to work on becoming better people. It's interesting, there's a commentary on the Chumash called the Baal HaTurim. The Baal HaTurim points out that the word v'natnu, which means to give, is a palindrome, which means that whichever way you read it, backwards or forwards, v'natnu is going to spell out v'natnu. So the Baal HaTurim, right, v'natnu is vav, nun, taf, nun, vav. And if you read it backwards, it spells out exactly the same word. So the Baal HaTurim explains something very beautiful, that when a person gives, they're receiving. When a person receives, they're giving. V'natnu, v'natnu, from both sides. So let's have a look and see. There was a very famous rabbi from a couple of generations ago. He lived in Bnei Brak, called the Chazon Ish. The Chazon Ish makes a differentiation, explains the differentiation between chesed and tzedakah. Tzedakah is something which has to go to somebody who's in need. So if a person comes to you and they ask you for money and you give them money and they don't really need that money, they're really just, pulling a fast one over you, then you have not fulfilled the mitzvah of giving tzedakah. Tzedakah has to reach the person who needs it. Chesed, on the other hand, yeah.
What if you don't know that the person's going to fast one?
So if you don't know that, then you end up thinking you fulfilled the mitzvah in its entirety, even though practically speaking you haven't.
So how do you find out?
When you get upstairs at the age of 120 and you're looking around for that one mitzvah you did, and God's going to say to you, I'm sorry, but it didn't get to where it was supposed to be going to. The Talmud actually points out that if God wants you to fulfill the mitzvah, then it will get to where it needs to get to. But if for whatever the reason, there's an important dimension over here. When you give charity, you put your hand in your pocket and you take something out and you give charity to somebody else, you're definitely fulfilling a part of the mitzvah, which means your part of the mitzvah, which is to give the money, that you're definitely doing, that you're fulfilling. If the money actually gets to where it needs to get to, that's a different dimension, and that is dependent upon God. So you're getting part of the mitzvah for sure. You're getting. Bless you. Says the Chazon Ish that tzedakah has to go to somebody who needs it. Chesed can be done to anybody. Right? The richest person in the world could walk into this room right now and we could do him a chesed, right? We could do him a kind deed, perhaps by giving him a pen so he could write us a check, whatever it is, right? But the bottom line is chesed is something which can be given to everybody. I don't know if you're familiar, there's a story way back in Genesis of a place called Sodom. In Sodom, the people were very, very cruel. One of the things that he did, according to the sages, one of the things that they did over there was that when poor people came to the city, they would give them money, but the money couldn't be used in any of the stores that they wanted to buy food in. And eventually the person would die, the poor person would die of starvation, and then the people who gave him the money would come and take their money back. Which means that giving is something which needs to be done. It's more than just putting your hand in your pocket. It's more than just helping somebody out. It's got to be given in a way where it's going to benefit the person. There was
So, let's say you see a beggar on the street. It's somehow clear to you as a doctor that this person is a drug addict. Are you helping them by giving them money?
Oh, that's a great question. Are you helping the person or not? It would seem that really you're not helping them. In fact, it would seem that by not giving them money, how's that for a paradox? By not giving the person money, you're helping them, and by giving them money, you're not helping them. Again, it's a difficult one to judge, right? It's a difficult one to call, but there is no doubt that there are definitely occasions where by giving somebody what they're asking for is going to be detrimental to them. And if you do that, the kindest thing that you can do is not to give them anything. Yeah?
Maybe in that case you could take the money and buy them some food.
Here, good idea, right? So take the money that you would have given them and buy them some food, or maybe buy them some clothing, or buy them something that's going to be beneficial for them, rather than give them the money which is going to get used for the wrong reason. Yeah?
I mean, but if it's not so clear cut and you can't tell an individual is addicted to drugs or something, and you really just don't know what's going to happen to your money, do you give or do you not?
Yeah, then you should give. In a situation like that, you should just, there's a concept in Judaism called being dan lekaf zchut, which means you've got to judge people favorably. You don't know the person is a drug addict, he's not a drug addict, he's an alcoholic, he's not an alcoholic, right? So what do? You see, in your eyes, it's clear that the person needs help. So then you can give them money, and you can work on the premise that the person is going to use the money for something that's beneficial for them, and he's not going to use it for something which is detrimental to them. Yeah?
See, I've always had this theory that by not giving money is also helping the person because it sort of motivates them to get up and do something about it instead of just
Possibly.
asking for money. Like, I always thought that way because if everybody sees that it's working and that they're always getting, they're never going to have the motivation to get up from that corner that they're sitting and asking.
I don't know. I mean, if anything, it's the opposite, and they're very motivated to sit in that corner, aren't they?
No, I know, but like, if you don't give and you realize...
I understand. I hear exactly what you're saying, which, for example, maybe then, instead of giving your money to the person sitting on the street corner, then maybe your money should be given to something which is a little bit more organized, so that you know that it's going. You've got here, here in Yerushalayim, unfortunately, there are plenty of families that are very, very needy. They've got parents that are working, and nevertheless they can't make ends meet, and there are organizations that supply them with food and supply them with clothing. So maybe you'd be better off giving your money to an organization like that in order to make sure that it's being used for the right thing. Yeah.
This may have been mentioned already, but what if you do everything right from your side in terms of giving, but it gets corruption, or something happens that stops it from getting to where it's the mitzvah?
Yeah, so at that
if
point,
you've done everything on your side right, where are you? But it doesn't actually...
You've received part of the mitzvah.
Yeah.
You haven't received it all, though,
Okay.
because the entirety of the mitzvah means that the money's got to get to where it needs to get to. Yeah.
So,
Yeah.
tough luck.
Yeah. Yeah.
Isn't there something in the Torah where it says it's better to give a man a job than money?
Yeah.
Yeah, it's interesting. The Shulchan Aruch, the Code of Jewish Law, teaches that the ultimate form, the very best form of charity, is by giving somebody a job, or by investing in somebody's business, which if you don't invest in it, it will go bankrupt. That is a fascinating idea. We would all imagine that the highest form of charity is finding somebody who is obviously destitute, giving them money, and trying to put them back up on their feet again. And yet, the Shulchan Aruch says that the best way to give charity is to allow the person to retain their dignity, right? And that's being done. If you can find somebody a job, so what are you doing? You can give somebody a job. What are you doing? You're restoring their dignity and allowing them to have a parnasa, a livelihood, in a dignified fashion. Yeah.
So then, say like in America, where it's like people, a lot of people live like illegally and still get jobs, so it's against the law to hire them. Would you be technically giving a mitzvah, or would you be breaking the law?
You would be breaking a law. There is a concept called dina de malchuta dina, which means that when you're living in a country, you should follow the laws of the country. That's part of the halakha, which means that if a person's doing something which is forbidden, even though they're helping out that person, it's going to contravene the halacha. Maybe they're gonna balance each other out, right? Doing a good deed and doing a not good deed, maybe you end up with nothing over there. Yeah.
What does it say about firing someone who you're employing?
Yeah, that's a great question. Can somebody be fired? Of course they can be fired. Right? If somebody's not doing their job properly, or somebody's causing problems inside of a work environment, then for sure they can be fired. You're not beholden to hold on to somebody simply because by firing them you're going to cause them a lot of hardship in their private lives. But there are different ways of firing people. I once met somebody in London who had a very vibrant company, and when he felt that people were not right for that particular work environment, so he would fire them, but before he fired them, he would try to arrange a different job in a different company for them. Which means, are you obligated to? You're not obligated to do that, but it's a very beautiful thing to do, right? Can you fire somebody for no particular reason, simply because you don't like the size of their nose? No, that already is halachically not an acceptable thing to do. But if somebody's not doing what they're supposed to do, or if your company is not doing so well right now, and it needs to downsize, so for sure it's okay to let people go. Yeah.
So you said something about maintaining someone's dignity. Say, I think this even applies to us more. We're young, we don't have that much money. There's a limit to how much tzedakah we can give, but we recognize that someone older with a business can give more tzedakah. But often somebody that needs tzedakah isn't the homeless guy sitting in the corner. it's somebody that truly needs it, but it's too shameful to ask for it.
Yeah.
What do you do?
What do you do? Well, if you know that the person needs help, you can arrange help in a subtle manner, right? In a way that's not going to be obvious, right? So, for example, you know that your next door neighbor is going through a very difficult period right now, right? But he doesn't want other people to know, right? And for whatever the reason, sometimes it's not going to be good for his business that people know that the business is not doing well. Sometimes it won't be good for his own sense of who he is, his own sense of self-worth. It's possible under such situations, if you're aware of what's going on, for example, to come and to ask somebody if they would like a loan. You know, I've come into a little bit of money, and I'm wondering if perhaps you would like a loan for something. There are ways of arranging help in ways that are a lot more subtle than just, you know, knocking on the door and saying, look, here's some bread and milk, feed your children. Right? But it's got to be done, for sure. It's got to be done in a sensitive fashion, that's for sure. There was a famous French philosopher in the 17th century called La Rochefoucauld, who said it's not enough to succeed, but your friends have to fail as well. Success in the outside world is something which is measured not just according to what I've achieved, but how much the people around me have not succeeded. So maybe the first question that needs to be asked is a very simple question, and the answer, of course, is entirely obvious. But do you have to be wealthy in order to give properly? So I hope that some of you over here are going to be familiar in Pirkei Avot, in the Ethics of the Fathers, in the 4th chapter. It asks, Ezehu Ashir, who is a rich man? And the answer that the Mishnah gives is Hasamech Bechelkoi, somebody who is content, somebody who is happy with what he has. That's an incredible idea. The definition of rich inside of Judaism has got nothing to do with how much you've got. It's to do with how you relate to what you've got. Which means a person can have a minimal amount and be rich according to the Mishnah, and a person can have a huge amount, a most enormous fortune, and not be rich according to the Mishnah, because he's not sameach bechelko, he's not happy with what he's got. So Rav Chaim Volozhiner, one of the foremost students of the Vilna Gaon, he lived about 200 years ago, explains that hasamech bechelko, if you speak any Hebrew, the word chelek means a bit, a portion, a piece. So he says if a person comes into this world and understands that they'll only ever achieve a part of what it is that they want, they'll only ever achieve a portion of what they want, then he'll be able to be happy. The Medrash says that a person walks out of this world, a person leaves this world only ever having experienced half of the desires that he would possibly want. But there's something else over here in the Mishnah, something which is very, very fundamental. It says, Asamech bechelko, somebody who's happy with what he's got. It's not enough to be satisfied with what you've got. It doesn't say hasovea bechelko. It says hasameach bechelko. A person's got to be happy with what it is that God has given to them. So listen to this. A great Hasidic Rabbi once said like this, that true joy means not getting tired of an acquisition after a while. This is an astonishing idea, it really is. We spend our lives running after things that we don't have. Things that we didn't know existed a moment ago. All of a sudden we see an advertisement for it, and now we need to have that thing. We desperately need it, even though 2 minutes ago we didn't know it was there, but now we desperately need to have it. So I always say like this, you ever see little children? You see how children work, it's very simple. They need a new toy. They'll drive you nuts until you finally get them that toy. They'll play with it for 5 minutes, and then they'll move on to the next toy that they need. And I always say, the only difference between children and adults is the cost of their toys. With a kid, you can get away with a new Lego set. With an adult, it's normally something considerably more expensive than that. Person drives a brand new car out of the garage and parks it, and the next day the person across the road has a car that's better than his. All of a sudden the joy that he has from his car is now diminished. It's gone. Now he's got to go and get himself a better car than he had before. So how are we supposed to combat this idea? The Mishnah in Ethics of the Fathers in chapter 6, it says, Kachi darka shel Torah. This is the way of the Torah. Pat b'melach toichal. Eat sparingly. B'meshura tishteh. Drink water. V'ala'ad tishan, and sleep on the floor. Doesn't sound like a very luxurious thing. Rav Meir Shapiro, who was the founder of the yeshiva of Chachmei Lublin, which was a revolutionary idea in the city of Lublin in Poland, that instead of having the students spread out all over the place, that he wanted to make an organized central location which would have a dormitory and it would have a dining room, went out to collect money. And he came to a very wealthy person in Lublin, and the person in Lublin says, but the Mishnah says, Pat v'melach toichal, that you should eat bread and salt, and you should sleep on the floor. Why are you trying to build such a luxurious place? So Rav Meir Shapiro says to him, it's very nice that you're quoting the Mishnah, but you're not quoting it all. The Mishnah says, Imata osei ken, if you do that, then you'll reach tremendous levels. So he said to the rich fellow, if you eat bread and salt, and you sleep on the floor, then you've got a right to question whether the yeshiva bochim need to do that as well. But if you live in a mansion and you sleep on a beautiful bed and you eat delicious food, then you don't have any right to question why the yeshiva bochim should be living in proper accommodations. What's the message of the story? Rabbi Yisrael Salanta, the founder of the Muslim movement, he used to say like this, that you should worry about your own spiritual needs and you should worry about the physical needs of others and not the other way around. Very often, what do? We look at the other person, we wonder why the other person isn't doing more than he's already doing, isn't more orthodox than he is, and we're worried about our own physical well-being. Said Rabbi Yisrael Salanta, the way to do it is the other way around. Worry about the physical well-being of those around you and worry about your own spiritual well-being. So we have to be what are called balei chesed. We have to learn how to give. Again, what are we giving over here? Giving over here, we're not necessarily talking about giving financially. There are other ways to be able to give as well. So if you're familiar with the words, there's a chesed and there is rachamim. What is rachamim? Compassion. Says the great Maharal, lived in Prague about 400 years ago. What is the difference between chesed and rachamim? So he said that chesed is something which comes from the giver. He naturally wants to help. Rachamim, on the other hand, comes from the receiver. When he tells over his story, it moves the person who's listening to it. What is rachamim? Rachamim is something very powerful, because rachamim is something which allows a person who may be selfish to want to give to the person who's telling over the story. They tell over a story. There was a very fascinating personality from the Rothschild family called Shimon. Shimon de Rothschild, he lived in Frankfurt, and he was walking in the street one day. He was humongously wealthy, and he was walking the streets one day, and somebody accosted him and told him a terrible story of deprivation and calamities that had befallen him. And Shimon de Rothschild was so moved by what he heard that he took, in the olden days they didn't have wristwatches, they had watches that went into their vests and they were held together with a chain. And if you were wealthy, you had a gold watch with a gold chain. And Shimon de Rothschild took off this gold chain, he detached it from the watch, and he gave it to this poor man. And the poor man was a little taken aback because this was the most enormous, it was worth a lot of money, it was the most enormous gesture. And he said to Shimon de Rothschild, he says, look, he says, if you want, I can come by tomorrow. You don't have to do this. Shimon de Rothschild told me he doesn't have any money on him right now. He says, if you want, I'll come by tomorrow and you can give me money instead of giving me the golden chain. And Shimon de Rothschild said the most extraordinary thing. He says, no, he says, right now I'm extremely moved by what you've told me. The chances are that by tomorrow the effect will have worn off and I'll give you much less. Stick with the chain, hold on to it. Rachamim is something which moves us to behave in a way that sometimes we wouldn't normally behave. We wouldn't naturally behave in a way like that. I tell over a cute story. I don't know if this is true or not. The Rothschilds were an enormous family. They were spread out all over Europe. And one of them was in France. And I tell over the story that one day he had a call from the Communist Party. They wanted to come to get a donation from him. So they came and they taught over all the dimensions of communism. They explained what it was all about, that everybody's equal and that everybody should have the same, and they're looking for a donation. And then this Rothschild, he says, please excuse me for a minute, and he went into his, into his back, into the inner sanctum over there, and he's there for 5 minutes, he's there for 15 minutes, he's there for 45 minutes, doesn't come out, they don't know what they're supposed to do. So finally, after about an hour, he comes out and he hands each one that's there 200 francs. 200 French francs. So they said to him, Baron, that's not really what we had in mind. The Communist Party, we need help. So he says, no, he says, I understood exactly what you were telling me. And I went back, I worked out exactly how much I was worth. I worked out exactly how many people there are here in France. And this is your share. Each person gets 200 francs. Rachamim is something which drives us to do things which are greater than that. The sages in the Talmud explain like this. A person has 3 friends. One who loved him dearly, one with whom he was friendly, and the last one was more of an acquaintance and a close friend. One day, the person is accused of plotting against the king, and he's ordered to come to the palace for a trial. So scared for his life, what does he do? He goes to his close friend and he says to him, please come with me. And you can imagine his shock when his closest friend categorically told him that there's no way that he's coming with him. So he goes to the second friend, and he told him that he'd be prepared to accompany him to the gates of the palace, but he's not going any closer than that. That's it. He's too scared. And then he turned to the third one, who was really more of an acquaintance. And the third one says not only would he come with him, but he would serve as his lawyer over there, as his attorney there in the trial. Explain the sages, the 3 friends are analogous to our money, to our family, and to our mitzvot, to the deeds that we do here in this world. We're so preoccupied with money that it seems to be the most central part of our existence. And yet, on the day that a person dies, you can't take his money with him. It has no value whatsoever. Very often, people in the pursuit of building a relationship with their best friend, with their money, they neglect their family. Says the rabbis, the second friend, that's his family. They'll come with him to the cemetery, but they can't go any further than that. They can't escort him up into the heavenly spheres. The only thing that a person takes with him are going to be what? His mitzvot. his good deeds, the actions that God wanted him to do. Very often the things that we're least attached to are the things that are going to serve us in the best stead when we get out of this world into the spiritual realms. We have to strive in order to be able to become Balei Chesed. We have to strive to have what's called a Leiv Tov. What is a Leiv Tov? A good heart. Because your good heart is going to be the center of all the chesed that you do. Have you ever wondered about your heart? It's an interesting thing. The heart does not fabricate blood. It doesn't make blood out of nothing. What does the heart do? It pumps, right? It's an oxygenation station. The blood comes in, and the same amount of blood that comes into the heart goes out of the heart as well. And yet it's interesting, when we talk about somebody who is kind, when we talk about somebody who is a Baal Chesed, we talk about the fact that they have a good heart. Which is interesting, because all the heart does is take what it's given and then passes it on. It doesn't produce anything from itself. Which means that we have to learn a little lesson over here. To be a Baal Chesed doesn't mean to create something out of nothing. It doesn't mean to create something that you don't have in order to be able to give it on. But rather, to be a Baal Chesed means to take what it is that God has given you. Some people are blessed with certain talents. Some people are blessed with other talents, with different traits. But to take that and to be able to try to pass it on to other people. Being a Baal Chesed means being sensitive to the needs of other people as well. In Frankfurt am Main, they had, before the Second World War, in the Orthodox communities, they had a fascinating custom over there. When people were sitting Shiva, nobody should ever know from these things, but when a close family member passes away, so the family sits Shiva for 7 days. They sit and they mourn. And they had a communal collection, like a great big bowl that was covered over, and it was taken to every Shiva house and it was put in the table in the middle, and people could give money. However, because it wasn't always clear whether people needed money or whether they were able to give money, nobody ever knew how much was in there, and if the family that was sitting Shiva needed, they could take money out of the collection bowl in order to use it for their own needs, and it would be filled up in different places. Which means we have to learn how to be sensitive to the needs of other people. But you have to recognize that God is in charge. There's the most beautiful story they tell. There was in the story in Genesis, it says that Abraham went to war against the kings, and he finally defeated the kings, and the king of Sodom was released from captivity. And he came and he said, I want you can keep all of the loot, all of the booty that you've taken from the war. Just give me my people back, my citizens. And Abraham says, I don't want anything from you. I don't want your money. I don't want your people. Why not? Because I don't want you walking around saying, I made Abraham wealthy. Rabbi Yisrael Salanter, the great founder of the Mussar movement, once asked a very simple question. God promised Abraham that he would become wealthy. When Avimelech, a different king, offered Abraham money, Abraham took it. When the king of Egypt offered him money, Abraham took it. When the king of Sodom offered him money, he didn't take it. He wouldn't take it, in case the king of Sodom went around saying, I made Abraham rich. So explain Rabbi Yisrael Salanter like this, the most beautiful idea. Rabbi Yisrael Salanter had a Rebbe. His spiritual mentor was somebody called Rabbi Zundel. Rabbi Zundel was a very poor man, and one day he received a message that they wanted him to come the next day to sit on a bet din, to be a judge in a complicated case over there in the next city along. So the next morning he gets up and he davens early and he goes off to the train station in order to get the train to the next city. He's standing in the line over there, and a enlightened, non-frum Jew walks past him, does a double take and comes back to him and says to him, "Aren't you Rebbe Zundel?" And he says, "Yes, I am." He says, "Rebbe Zundel, you won't remember me, but when I was a kid, every Yom Tov, every festival, my father would bring me to you to wish you a good Yom Tov." Obviously, a lot of water has passed under the bridge since then. This fellow is no longer frum. So he says, "Oh, it's very nice." He says, "Rebbe Zundel," he says, "where are you going?" He says, "I'm going to the next city." He says, "Rebbe Zundel, do you have a ticket to get on the train?" So Rebbe Zundel says, "No." He says, "I don't have a ticket." He says, "Why not?" He says, "I don't have any money." So he says to him, "Rebbe Zundel, how do you think you're going to get onto the train without a ticket?" So he says, "Don't you worry." He tells him in Yiddish, "The Eibischer zu helfen, God will help." So this enlightened Jew got rid of all vestige of being religious. He says, "Oi!" He says, "Rebbe Zundel," he says, "that's ridiculous." And he goes stomping off. Anyway, in the distance they hear the hoot of the train, and everyone starts getting ready, and this fellow comes back and says, "Rebbe Zundel," he says, "did God give you a ticket yet?" And he says, "Don't worry." He said, "God will take care of everything." So the fellow walks off in a huff again. Anyway, they open up the gates, everyone starts moving, he's getting closer and closer to the gate. Rebbe Zundel, and finally this fellow comes to me and says to him, "Rebbe Zundel, did God give you a ticket, yes or no?" He says, "Not yet, it's going to be okay." He's like 5 people away from the gate. So this Jew puts his hand in his pocket and he takes out 2 rubles. And he says to him, "Here, Rebbe Zundel, this time it's on me." He says, "Next time, don't rely on God to take care of these things." Said Rabbi Yisrael Salanta that when Abraham took money from Avimelech and from the king of Egypt, from Paro, they knew that they were vehicles that God was using them in order to enrich him. And they were happy for that to be. But the king of Stone was so stupid, he didn't realize that this was an unparalleled opportunity to do a chesed and to be able to fulfill the word of God. And he would go around telling everybody, "I made Abraham rich." And Abraham says, "I don't want money like that, I don't want." Which means what? What does this mean? Practically speaking, it means that it's not enough just to give, but we have to be aware of why we're giving, and we have to be aware of the function of giving as well. So listen to this. Rabbi Dessler, one of the great Jewish thinkers from the previous generation, he says the desire to take is the root of all evil in the world. That's a pretty heavy statement. The desire to take is the root of all evil here in this world. Now, according to what he's saying, that means that all of you have to start working on wanting to give. The problem is, if you all want to give, then no one's going to take. So I'm volunteering to be the taker, even though obviously it's a great personal sacrifice, right? But I'm volunteering to be the taker so that you people can learn how to give. What do you say about that? That's not bad, right? When was the last time you heard such a selfless declaration, huh? The truth is that Rabbi Dessler is really paraphrasing King Solomon. King Solomon says, "Soine matnus yichya," somebody who despises presents, he lives. What's the problem? Because all our character traits, explains Rabbi Dessler, all our character traits can be traced back into whether we are givers or whether we are takers. Are we going to give or are we going to take? It's fascinating when you think about it for a minute. Even somebody sets up a company in order to be able to supply things to other people. So he's doing a great chesed. He's giving them plenty of things. But of course, the driving force behind what it is that he wants to do is to generate more profits for himself. So is he giving or is he taking? The Chafetz Chaim, one of the greatest rabbis who lived in the pre-Second World War generation, the Chafetz Chaim had a little grocery store, which in the end he closed down because people were coming to shop from him because they wanted to give him a livelihood, and he was scared that he was taking away the livelihood from other people that had a grocery store in the neighborhood. Oh, there's a fabulous story they tell. Chafetz Chaim once had to come to a secular court in Russia, where was it? Probably in Lithuania, in order to give testimony for something. And before he came, the judge asked the lawyer, "Who is this fellow?" So the lawyer says to the judge, "Here, let me tell you a story about this man. He had a little grocery store. Somebody came in one day and grabbed something and went running out without paying. And the Chafetz Chaim ran down the street after this fellow shouting, 'I forgive you, I forgive you.'" So the judge looks at the lawyer and he says, "Tell me," he says, "do you believe that story?" So the lawyer says, "Your Honor, whether it's true or not, I don't know, but they don't tell stories like that about you and me." There's an Indian over here, right? Who are we? Are we going to be Balei Chesed? Are we going to be thinking about the other person? Or are we going to be thinking about ourselves? Rav Dessler told over the story of a family that was separated during the war, where a father and his young son ended up in one zone, and the mother ended up in a different zone. And a few years later, once the war was over, they finally reconnected with each other. And the relationship between the son and the mother was never the same as it was beforehand. It never got back to the same levels. So ask Rav Dessler, why? What happened over here? What changed? And he explains that it was the cruel fate that for those years that they were separated from each other, the mother wasn't able to give to her son. Those years of giving were missing. Why do relationships fall apart? Because at heart, we're really takers. And when we fall in love with somebody, we want to build a relationship with somebody, so we become givers, because that's the way that we have of being able to show that person that we care for them. And as the relationship begins to wane, we revert back to being takers again, and then things start to fall apart. Some people give by taking, and some people take by giving. It's difficult to know. Let's say you have a friend who's in hospital on the other side of Yerushalayim, and you decide that you're going to go and visit him, and you spend an hour and a half getting to the hospital, and you go in, and he's asleep. So what would most people do? You just spent an hour and a half getting to this fellow. What would most people do? So you know what? You're sort of like, you'll push him a little bit, and he'll wake up and say, "Oh, were you asleep? Oh, I'm so sorry." Right? Are you giving or are you taking? I spent an hour and a half of my precious time going to the hospital, and he's not even going to be awake in order for me to be able to wish him a refuah shalema, that he should have a speedy recovery. So I'm going to wake him up and tell him, am I giving or am I taking? I'm taking, I'm not giving. If anything, the person who's sick is now giving, because you just woke him up and now he's got to spend some time with you, when really what he wanted to do was be asleep. So we have to learn how to give. What about ambition? Is it okay to be ambitious? For sure it's okay to be ambitious. Ambition gets you places. We all know that. Nietzsche, one of his famous phrases was, "The oldest and the healthiest instincts. One must want to have more in order to become more." You hear that? One has to want more in order to become more. I have yet to come across a truly successful person who's not ambitious. Success doesn't just fall into somebody's lap out of nowhere. It's something that we've got to have. It's something we've got to build upon. It's something that we've got to want. Super rich people lose their money. Why? Because they take the enormous wealth that they've got that they don't have enough time to spend anyway, and they invest it in other things in order to make themselves even more. So maybe we would say to ourselves, that's a pretty silly thing to do. They should have just cashed out whilst they had the opportunity, and they could have lived the most beautiful life up until then. But a person doesn't make that kind of money without an incredible drive. A person doesn't grow in anything. It's not necessarily money. You won't grow in the professions that you've chosen unless you have drive. You won't grow in your spiritual lives unless you have drive. You won't grow in your personal lives unless you have drive. I once saw a fascinating idea. Animals eat until they're no longer hungry. What about us? Do we? No. Especially if you're Jewish, right? Oh. We just keep going until we explode. That's it. Phew. Huh?
Animals do eat as long as they have the.
That's what it said. If you,
like dogs or cats, right? They'll continue to eat and eat. If you like leave a bag of food open, they'll continue to eat, which is why you give them portions. Hide the rest.
Not being a dog or a cat, I don't know. I'm just telling you what it says over here. It could be that maybe animals in the wild are animals that they'll eat whatever they need. They won't eat more than that. It could be that domesticated animals are being taught to be like humans, right? So you put a bag of food in front of them, they'll just eat the whole bag. It's possible, right? There's a drive. We're going to have drive. There's a fantastic story they tell. Henry Ford, who was a rabid anti-Semite, was once in a place called St. Thomas. St. Thomas is one of these beautiful islands not far off the coast of America. And he sees a fellow sitting on the wall, sunning himself. So he says to him, "What do you do?" The fellow says, "I'm a fisherman." So Henry Ford says to him, "What do you do? How do you be a fisherman?" So he says, "I get up early in the morning, I take my nets, I go out on my boat, I find the place where I feel, it's like an instinct, where I feel the fish are going to be. I drop my nets to the right kind of a depth, and then I draw them back up, and when I've got a boat full of fish, I go back in, I sell it in the market, and then I'm done for the day." So Henry Ford says to him, "Listen," he says, "I got a great idea for you. If you stayed out an extra few hours on the boat, you'll have more fish to sell." So the fellow says, "Okay, and then what do I do? Once I've sold more fish, then what?" He says, "Well, after a while, you'll have saved up enough money to buy another boat. And then you can have 2 boats out there." So says the fellow to Henry Ford, he says, "Okay, and once I've got 2 boats, what happens next?" So Henry Ford says to him, "Well, then you'll be generating more profits, and after a while, you could have a whole fleet of boats out there, all working, bringing in, generating a large profit." And then the fellow says, "Okay, and what do I do then?" And Henry Ford says to him, "Well, at that point, when you've got enough, you can then sell your fleet to somebody else, and you can retire and take it easy." He says, "But that's what I'm doing now." Which means ambition is great, drive is great, but don't lose sight of the goal. What are our goals? If we've got spiritual goals, if we've got professional goals, if we have personal goals, not to turn ourselves into workaholics to the point where we're not able to be able to get what we want because we don't even realize that we've already got it. What is chesed? Chesed is giving according to the Torah. To give in a way that's going to be beneficial and to want to give. I want to end with a very, very powerful story. After the Second World War, in London, there was a yeshiva in Stamford Hill called Schneider's Yeshiva. It was pretty famous at the time. And there was rationing going on in London after the war. There was only a certain amount of food that each person could have. But the kosher bakery told the yeshiva that if they sent somebody every day, they would give them the leftover bread from the day before for free. It meant getting on a bus and having a little journey and coming back again. So they had a rota. Every day somebody else was supposed to go and supposed to pick up the bread. Like with most rotas, especially in yeshivas, it broke down. And in the end, one boy, every day the same boy, was the one getting on the bus, going to bring the bread and bringing it back, that there should be bread for them to eat for breakfast. There was also a rota in the yeshiva where somebody went around every morning waking everybody up. He had to get up earlier than everybody else, and he had to wake everybody up in order to get them up in time to come daven shacharit. And it was supposed to be a rota, but like with all these rotas, it broke down, and in the end, there was just one boy doing the rounds every morning, the same boy. One day, the Rosh Yeshiva, Rav Schneider, got up and he spoke to all of the boys there in the yeshiva, and he said to them like this. Both of these boys were called Moshe, the two boys that were doing, the one that was going to get the bread and the one that was going to wake everybody up in the morning. They both were called Moshe. And Rav Schneider said like this, he said, I'm not a prophet. He says, but I'm telling you that the boy who wakes everybody up every morning, who gets up earlier than everyone else in order to make sure that everybody gets up in time to pray, his Torah is going to be heard throughout the entire world. And the boy who goes on the bus in order to pick up the bread and bring it back here every day, his wealth is going to be heard throughout the entire world. Those two Moshes grew up. The Moshe who woke everybody up in the morning turned into somebody called Rav Moshe Sternbuch. You may not be familiar with his name, but in the religious world, he's one of the foremost halachic authorities alive today. He lives here in Yerushalayim. He's the most astonishing Talmud scholar. His Torah is heard throughout the entire world. The other Moshe grew up and became the famous Moshe Reichman, who established a company called Olympia in York in Toronto. And in its heyday, it was worth billions of dollars back in the 70s and the 80s, in a time when billionaires were very few and far between. It was the fourth largest construction company in the world. The beauty of the story is this. About 20 years ago, somebody went to Moshe Reichman to remind him, in inverted commas, of the story. And Moshe Reichman's immediate response was, until today, I'm sorry that I wasn't the one who went around waking everybody up. Which means giving is something fundamental. The Reichman family, until today, have given tens upon tens of millions of dollars to charity, to help those in need. Their input financially into the Jewish world has been immeasurable. And yet, real giving is going to be measured by the impact that we have on people physically, on the impact we have on people spiritually, and the impact that we have on people emotionally. That means that all of us here, I don't imagine we're going to reach the levels of Rav Moshe Sternbuch. It could be that someone over here maybe will reach the levels of the Reichmans in their physical wealth, but I imagine most of us won't. But we can still succeed at becoming Balei Chesed, to be able to give to other people by using the tremendous traits that HaKadosh Baruch Hu, that God gave to each and every one of us, to use them in the way that they're supposed to be used. Amen.